So let me welcome all of you to this ICA special lecture by Professor David Arase on the theme of Chinese and Japanese competition in Africa. We are competing with a whole lot of developments, including the report on withdrawal or whatever it's called, disengagement from locals. So a lot of friends from journalistic fraternity they are missing because they're busy filing away their stories. Professor Arase is he is at present at Nanjing Hopkins-Nanjing Center of Johns Hopkins University. He has been professor of politics at Pomona College in Claremont, California, where he taught for 22 years. He has held a series of other assignments. I will not go into that. I would like to emphasize that his area of scholarship is again wide-ranging. Last two books he came out with. One was on US-Japan balancing soft and hard power in East Asia, which he authored in 2010, and then 2016, last year, he edited a volume on China's rise in the East Asian order, and presently he is working on a book on China's rise to predominance in Asia, which is expected early next year. Now, he is presently visiting India and speaking on different topics. This afternoon, he has selected for his lecture at our request a theme which looks at China's growing profile in Africa, including in terms of its trade diplomacy, and how does it compare with Japan. Japan has been present in Africa for longer, but it's also forced to revisit some of the thrust areas of this diplomacy vis-a-vis Africa, partly in light of what China is doing in that continent. As part of China's quest of regional global leadership role, while it has focused primarily on its neighborhood, there's also been rapid expansion of its footprint in distant continents, including Africa and Latin America, something which is not adequately understood in India. So we wanted Professor Arase to talk about how China is expanding its presence in Africa, where it has acquired not just economic and commercial dimension, but wider, broader geostrategic complexity. And he will compare that with Africa, with Japan's trade diplomacy vis-a-vis Africa. So I'll now request Professor Arase to deliver his ICS special lecture.
Thank you, Ambassador Kanta, and it's such a great pleasure and honor to be speaking here before such a distinguished crowd at the Institute for Chinese Studies here at the ICWA. I'd like to thank my friend Mahendra Gaur for helping arrange things as well. Let me just mention before I begin I'll make a few preliminary remarks. First is I've been teaching in China since 2011 at the Johns Hopkins Nanjing Center, and this is where young Americans and Chinese study together in a small environment in a postgraduate program focusing on international relations. And this is where a good number of America's China experts are trained. Just turn it on. Okay. At this, the center trains actually a good number of American and European China experts who have advanced Chinese language. You have to have at least 4 years of Chinese to enter, and all the work that international students do is done in Chinese with Chinese professors. Everything is read in Chinese, everything is written in Chinese. you room with a Chinese person, and it would be wonderful if we had a few Indian students join the program as well. You would get to know not just a rising generation of Western experts, but also Chinese experts, because the Chinese students who attend are very, very capable, fluent in English, and they study with the international faculty, meaning me, and their work is entirely in English. They study Western materials. We have VPN access to the rest of the world. So we have academic freedom. We can talk about Tiananmen Square inside, but only inside the school. So it's a very special place, and if any of you have or know of young Indians who would be interested in this kind of a program, please have them contact me. Okay, so now this topic I've tailored a bit to cater to what I think your interest is, which will be mostly on Chinese aid. So I'm going to go very light on the Japanese side, but raise the Japanese example of aid in Africa and aid in general to make basically 2 points. The first point is, the first important point about the Chinese aid is to understand the strategy, the aid strategy that they're employing in Africa and elsewhere. And then the larger point, which we can get from comparing the Japanese and Chinese aid, is to understand why Chinese aid is unlikely ever to converge with Western aid norms. And this can tell us why China is not going to converge with Western norms in other areas. So it can tell us something about how China is, in fact, quite different from the Western powers. It has little intention to join the West. In fact, it would like to establish itself in opposition to the West, as an alternative to the West, in constructing a different kind of world order, a different model of world governance. And so this is one thing that we can get from looking at this policy area. But first we want to cover aid policy in Africa by both the Chinese and Japanese, so that you can sort of see what's going on and also see what the differences are. And I might also add that last month I was in Tokyo and I went to JICA Research Institute. JICA is the Japanese aid agency, and gave 2 talks on this topic. And it was a very, very good exchange. And I can tell you that the Japanese are looking at this particular topic very closely these days. Okay, so with that I'll begin, and I'll go through these slides rather quickly, because if any of you have questions, we can always come back. Okay, I don't want to bore you overly much. And how long should I speak? About 50 minutes? 50, right? Okay. 45? Q&A, okay. All right, so here, the question is foreign aid. There's a lot of confusion in the foreign aid when discussing foreign aid. It's like when the West talks about aid, we tend to talk about ODA, official development assistance. When the Chinese talk about foreign aid, they're talking about something a little different. And so it's like comparing apples and oranges. But the basic idea of foreign aid is that a rich country gives a poor country resources for developmental purposes, but then you have to get into the details of what exactly these purposes are. And this is where China and the West think somewhat differently in the details at least. So here's the Western definition of of aid or economic aid or development assistance, official development assistance. This formula was devised within the OECD under American guidance or American leadership in the 1960s. And it's government-to-government assistance for economic development purposes, not for military purposes, and not for economic, not to advance commercial interests of the donor, and it has to be concessional. Now, if we look at Chinese aid in Africa and how it begins, the point to make here is that Chinese aid to Africa really begins for a political purpose. It's all about politics. It's really not about economics. This is, of course, right after the Sino-Soviet split. The Chinese began to look for independent leadership in the world socialist movement. And of course, the rhetoric was opposed American imperialism. And the picture here that you see is Zhou Enlai in Africa visiting in 1963 to 64. His trip lasted about 2 months. And as far as the key dates are concerned, aid to sub-Saharan Africa begins in 1960. In 1964, Zhou Enlai lays out the so-called 8 principles of aid, which are the first 4 principles are still basically observed by China today. The rest have been pretty much forgotten. The high point of Chinese aid is the Tazara Railway, the Tanzania Zambia Railway. It's a turnkey project. In other words, it's entirely Chinese designed and built with Chinese labor and Chinese financing. It's quite a large project. You can see 1,860 kilometers. Back then, it took about $500 million, and it is invoked. Whenever you talk about China-Africa relations, this particular project always comes up as a symbol of China's commitment to Africa's political independence and economic independence. Aid tapers off after 1978. This is when we get into the reform period. I can get into some of the details of how that happened. But this is the main outline of the early phase of Chinese aid to Africa. Now, aid resumes basically after the Cold War. So after Tiananmen, after the end of the Cold War, China turns its attention back to Africa. This time, there was a political component. That is, after Tiananmen, China faced international sanctions, political isolation, and so China turned back to Africa, initially looking to rebuild political relationships, escape isolation, but then subsequently, as its economic reforms progressed, and China, particularly after '92, had its developmental outlook stabilized. They began to look forward into the future, looking to develop access to resources that they would need for their industrialization. So they, in this period, here, by the way, is Zhu Rongji in his visit to Africa in '95, and that visit, I think, was critical to focusing the minds of the Chinese government on how to do aid. And the model that they came up with is what we would call 对外援助. And basically it means foreign assistance. It's not ODA. It's much broader than ODA. The Chinese are a little vague about what's included and what's excluded when they talk about doing Yuanzhu. It's mostly Westerners who want more precision and say, is it aid, is it ODA, is it not, what are the terms? But the Chinese are pretty loose about this concept. And they include not just economic development assistance, but they also include military assistance, as you'll see. They also include the forms of political assistance. It's a much broader term. However, as time has gone on, the Chinese have learned that Westerners are really interested in understanding China's aid in terms of ODA, and so today there's this confusion about Chinese aid. Chinese experts who are familiar with the West and the way the West thinks will try to talk more in terms of what China does that might qualify as ODA. But for others, they think more broadly. They might, for example, include Chinese direct investment, funded perhaps by the China Development Bank, and view that as foreign assistance, because even though the CDB, the Chinese Development Bank, might give a loan at, let's say, 5% interest or so, which sounds like a commercial rate almost, and it wouldn't qualify as a concessional loan according to OECD standards. Nonetheless, that African country wouldn't be able to procure that kind of a loan, that size, at that interest rate. And so there is a certain degree of subsidy and risk acceptance by the Chinese. And so I think, to their way of thinking, this qualifies as aid, even though to the West it wouldn't. Okay, now the going out strategy, which began in the late 90s, actually technically from 96 after Jiang Zemin came back from a trip to Africa, he made a speech where he talked about this going out strategy. It only really gets going in the late 90s, and this is when you see a big growth of Chinese aid to Africa. Okay. In the year 2000, this triennial FOCAC begins. This is a main meeting held every 3 years at the ministerial level at least. Occasionally a summit will be held between China and its African partners. So the first summit, the first FOCAC summit, it's a forum on Chinese-African cooperation, that's what it means. But it's 2006, and this really caught the attention of people. In fact, it surprised and shocked a lot of Western countries, including Japan, but others as well. 32 African leaders attended, and $5 billion in soft loans were extended, and $1 billion for a China-Africa fund. And at this summit, China is seeking a strategic partnership. And based on those principles that you see here, like political equality, mutual trust, mutually beneficial economic cooperation, cultural exchange. These echo the 1964 principles that Zhou and I mentioned, but and the first aid white paper comes in 2011. At this point, because Chinese aid is attracting so much attention, and in fact some degree of alarm in the West, China defines this so-called South-South aid agenda, which is in contrast, stands in contrast to a North-South aid agenda being implemented by the OECD, by the DAC countries. And so for this is why I'm suggesting that Chinese aid is not going to converge with Western aid. So, and it answers many questions and criticisms. Now here we can see some, I'll give you some sense of, quantitatively, of what's been happening. Now, this was done by this Japanese researcher. He's the director of the China Research Institute, and he was stationed in Beijing for 4 years. So he's very, very interested in Chinese aid. And he managed to disaggregate, and nobody else has done this, disaggregate Chinese government statistics to figure out what China is doing in terms of Western ODA effort. The Chinese don't really publicize what they're doing in foreign aid. They don't actually keep foreign aid accounts. It's up to other people to figure out, foreigners to figure out exactly what they're doing. And the Chinese themselves aren't even clear about it. In fact, I've been to the Chinese Aid Institute, and when they want numbers, they go to these numbers, right? Because it's nobody's job in China to collect these numbers. Okay. So you can see here, this is the level of Chinese effort in a Western ODA terms, so roughly $6 billion. This is gross disbursement, so it doesn't take into account loan reflows, that is, flows back to China from past loans. Now, you can see here in the red dotted line, that's gross disbursement of preferential exports buyer's credits. These don't qualify as ODA, but nonetheless, they're ODA-like. These would be classified as other official flows in Western terms. So you can see that if you add the two, 6 billion plus 7 billion, you get 13 billion, which is quite significant. Right? That's a pretty big number of aid, right? Pretty big number. And so just using the Western definition of ODA, this is what you get. But when you count the other, and this is preferential credit, trade-related credits, you get a quite significant number. This is net. So if you net out the loan reflows, that is the reflow payments from past loans, this is what you get. So a little over 5 billion, 5.5, and about 6.5. Okay. And this breaks it down. This breaks down the spending categories. You see bilateral grants and interest-free loans. This bilateral concessional loans. This gives you net foreign aid. Multilateral organizations. This is and then this gives you the net foreign net total for 2015, which is 5.4 billion. And this gives you the stuff that doesn't qualify as ODA, and you can see what that number is. Now this compares China's ODA effort to the Western ODA donors. Okay. And you can see that China here, this is the ODA effort according to Western ODA definitions. And you can see it's roughly 5 billion in 26. This is estimated in 2016. Okay. And so it doesn't look so significant if you look at it that way. You can, by the way, Japan is deceptive. Its net is just over 10 billion, but that's because, believe it or not, because of the history of Japanese aid and its dependence on loans. Today, Japan is getting roughly $10 billion in loan repayments a year. So if you net out that. So in terms of gross disbursements, Japan is actually doing more like 22 billion a year. But it's getting back so much from past loans. So the Japanese line is also rather deceptive because their program is huge. It's 20 billion. They're spending 20 billion a year. Here's Chinese loans to Africa. And so you can see here how that's defined. Different people define it differently, but this is according to the SAIS, China Africa Research Program. So Chinese government, banks, contractors, this is the amount that was lent, $94.5 billion from 2000 to 2015. And you can see here the numbers. I sent somebody here the PowerPoint, and Mr. Jacob. So, I don't know if he's here, but anyway, and you have it here, so if anybody wants a copy, yeah, you can, feel free. But, by the way, let me also say that in this PowerPoint there's major copyright infringement going on, so please don't publish it. This is purely for educational purposes, okay? I didn't have time to give everybody credit and all this stuff, so please, just use it amongst yourselves. Here's China and Africa, trade and investment. And it only goes up to 2010 here, but you can see that the basic point here is that the growth of trade as a result of China's aid efforts, largely as a result of that, is grown quite well. And you can see here where Africa stands in relation to total global outbound investments by China. So about almost 14%. And that's fairly steady. One thing to notice, though, is that China's aid to Africa takes up about a third of its aid program, but it attracts a much smaller proportion of its trade and investment. And so China is really focusing on Africa, putting in a big strategic effort. They're investing in this relationship. So here are some key points to bear in mind when we're talking about Chinese aid. The grant portion of it targets social aid, in other words, education, health, community, various community level projects. The loans tend to target plant and infrastructure, and interest-free loans are given by the Exim Bank, usually tied to exports of Chinese goods. By the way, Chinese aid is all tied to Chinese commercial interests. The CDB, China Development Bank, gives low-interest loans, usually negotiated between leaders. And this is the breakdown. 61% of these loans are for infrastructure, 16% for industry. The economic projects tend to be capital intensive, mines, railways, infrastructure, and production, capital intensive production projects. And they're SOE led. In other words, state-owned enterprises are the implementers. They get the contracts. The financiers are Chinese state-owned banks. Social and cultural aid has been, the Chinese are trying harder in this area ever since the first aid white paper. And these tend to be small scale and numerous. They cover very well and very evenly all 51 African countries with whom China has normal relations. Usually grant funded and often involving provincial level agencies. So what happens is the central government tasks provinces taking care of this country. You're Jiangsu, you take care of these 5 African countries. And then they take over the job of health cooperation and other things. As far as the diplomacy of aid, it's done usually at top level. At the top level, government leaders meeting, they come to these broad agreements. China is happy to give you $5 billion of aid or whatever, $1 billion, 500 million. They tend to be very quick. This is one of the draws. This is one of the attractions of Chinese aid. It's done very quickly with very little red tape. Usually it's just an agreement in principle. They'll shake hands on the deal, and then it's up to the working level later to work out the details. So you can see it's very attractive, right? It's very different from Western aid, which is very bureaucratic, involves a lot of care and maintenance, and African developing countries often don't have the resources to maintain these aid relationships. The Chinese really make it easy, right? Mutual respect for sovereignty. A win-win mutual benefit. So let's look at what this actually means. What it means is both sides understand that this is an exchange. Both sides are getting a political benefit, and both sides are getting an economic benefit. Now, I previously mentioned that Chinese aid is fully tied, which means that Chinese banks and Chinese enterprises are penetrating Africa. And their workers, Chinese workers, build these projects, so they import tens of thousands of workers. Many of them stay, do petty business, they settle, and become sort of resident Chinese who are linked back to China, and who are a resource, a human resource for China, looking to the future. Political benefit or economic benefits, well, that we can get into that more later. Mutual respect for sovereignty. Basically, what the Chinese mean by this is that after the agreement is made, the Chinese side is not going to pry into, did you use the money correctly? Can you please open your books? We want to make sure there's no corruption going on here, like you might get with Western donors. This is not happening with China. Right? This is again one of the attractions of Chinese aid. Not a lot of questions about anti-corruption measures, good governance, good accounting, which really gets Western donors pretty upset. Because what Western donors want to do is to promote good governance, promote accountability, but the Chinese come in and they say, well, we're just going to trust you, please. So, and by the same token, the donor, the recipient, respects China and doesn't ask too many questions. Just the Chinese just say, we'll get the job done. Just let us do the project our way, and we'll get it finished. Okay. So there's another thing to notice about Chinese aid is there's no dedicated field staff. JICA, Western donors have country offices, right, the aid agencies. They go and inspect the projects, they do follow-up, they read the books. The Chinese really don't do that. The Ministry of Commerce officers in the embassies are tasked with this, but they're busy doing many, many things. They're not very expert on aid issues. They're just too busy to really follow up on the many aid projects going on in Africa. So administratively, it's very light. And as I just mentioned, the net result is, from the economic viewpoint, is Chinese trade and investment is promoted. Now, here I want to talk a little bit about how China is very future-oriented. As I mentioned previously, Africa gets about 30% of Chinese aid, actually a little more than that, but only about 10% of trade and investment. And China sees a strategic opportunity in Africa, and it saw it actually quite early, from the 90s. After the Cold War, Western donors pretty much forgot about Africa, ignored Africa, and the Western aid effort in Africa went down quite a bit. China saw this as an opportunity, it stepped in. And the other curious irony about the situation is that the West actually succeeded in promoting the Washington Consensus liberalizing reforms in Africa, but did not actually follow up with a lot of Western trade and investment effort. What the Chinese did, they took advantage of the liberalization that happened and followed and came in after that. And in this particular time, the West started emphasizing democracy, human rights, transparency, accountability. The Chinese came in and said, "We'll just, you trust us and we'll trust you," which is a very attractive message. Now, it's not just trade and investment promotion today. It's an investment in a growing market with a vast potential. And so China wants to get in on the ground floor. It also gives China political leverage, which China very much wants. If it wants to lead the global South, if it wants to construct a real South-South structure in global affairs, in competition with a North-South structure, this is quite useful. And so let's just get on with the rest of it. More recently, this relationship is filled out. The security and strategic dimension has come more to the fore as China consolidated its economic leverage and influence in Africa. It began to step up its engagement in this dimension. So in 2006, China issued an Africa policy white paper. And in this paper, they defined security cooperation. You see here, military cooperation is specifically mentioned. These areas of conflict settlement, judicial and police cooperation, non-judicial, all that pretty much follows what the West is doing, but what's different is the military component. FOCAC 2012, this is where this military cooperation becomes specific. You can look up the details on that. And then at the next FOCAC in 2015, you have $100 million devoted in military grants to the African Union. And I think if you talk to normal bureaucrats or Chinese who aren't ODA experts but international relations experts, they would probably view this military aid as being part of part of foreign aid. FOCAC 2015 here gives $60 million in military grant aid. That's in addition to the $100 million previously announced. And China gives assistance to these African efforts, the African Standby Force, African Peace and Security Architecture, capacity for, this is a rapid reaction force. So China will give material and training for these purposes. It's a comprehensive strategic and cooperative partnership. The relationship between China and Africa is renamed this way, which is fairly high level. And today there are 2,200 Chinese UN peacekeepers in 7 African countries. Economically, you can see here there's 31 African countries have over $1 billion in trade with China. There are over 3,000 Chinese firms invested, $35 billion by the end of 2015. There's also a lot of debt. The aid projects, I'm sure you've all read about the railways, mines. They're debt financed. It's difficult to see how it's all going to be repaid. It's unlikely to be repaid all in cash. So these other forms of payment are going to be, I think, quite important. Payment in kind. The Angola agreement is a case in point. That was explicitly, the loan arrangement was explicit. It said, if you can't pay us in cash, we'll take your oil as payment. There's also debt to equity. That is, the Chinese are open to taking ownership of assets if debt repayments can't be made. So this might mean, for example, China ends up owning some of these railways that governments have contracted, have borrowed money to build. And finally, political payments, political favors, subservience to China, because of the heavy weight of debt. Obviously, it differs by country, but those countries that are heavily indebted will, of course, be under a lot of pressure to toe the line. Another thing about it is this vertical division of labor, which opens up China to criticism of neocolonialism. First of all, there's a structural trade surplus opening up today as commodity prices fall and as China penetrates capital and consumer markets in Africa. The Chinese exports to Africa are going to structurally rise as Africa develops, but the commodities that China imports may in fact have peaked. As China shifts its industrial structure to services, it's less resource intensive. So anyway, I think you're likely to see a structural trade surplus opening up in decades ahead. And the structure of trade is very vertical. Africa is sending low value, energy and commodities, and China is sending back manufacturing, industrial goods, high technology goods. You can see here the composition of trade over time so far. This is what's exported to China. The red is fuel, right? The green is crude materials. The yellow is manufactured goods. But you can see here most of it's just fuel and raw materials. What China sends to Africa, manufactured goods, machinery. So this is what I was talking about earlier. Now, this is the thing about Africa's future. You can see here its demographic pyramid, and estimates are that by the end of the century, the population of Africa is going to exceed the population of both China and India. It's going to be a huge market, and it's going to be a growth driver from about the middle of the century on. Right? And you can see here, demographically, right? This is Africa. Its share of world labor, right? It's labor growth, and as you can see, here's 2055, for example. You can see that if China can industrialize and develop and usefully employ all these people, there's going to be enormous growth in Africa. And China is in at the ground floor. Right? That's what it's using its aid to do. China-Africa trade. Here you can see China exporting to Africa, China importing. And this is what I was talking about. You see the orange bars? That's Chinese exports. That's pretty much going up, and probably will continue to go up, and maybe even accelerate as Africa develops, particularly the middle class. The middle class grows, and as Africa industrializes, these exports are really going to grow. But if you look at imports, you can see here it's going down, reflecting the fall in commodity prices. Here's this stock of foreign direct investment, Chinese direct investment in Africa. You can see it's going up, as you might expect. And here, in the yellow here, you can see these are countries that have received over $1 billion of Chinese direct investment. Okay. And the white means nothing. There's no significant investment. But you can see that where China is really focused its heavy investment efforts. And all Eastern Africa, by the way, gets a significant amount. That's 100 million to 1 billion. Okay, so you can see here, this is looking at China in perspective. Here's orange is China, the green is the DAC countries, the OECD countries, right? And others. And you can see that China's share is growing steadily, the DAC share is declining, and here's imports. So political results. So China has established its aid as an alternative to Western ODA. It's very popular. It's made China China popular. The Afrobarometer survey of 2016 finds 63% favorable toward China. Today it has 52 or 54 sub-Saharan African states have official relations with China. And China ranks with the U.S. as the most favorably viewed country. The U.S., I think, slightly is still a little ahead. And politically, as China's control of the economy or economic influence in the continent grows, it will have more and more influence over politics, both domestic and foreign policies and effort. Political support. This political leverage pays off. For example, with respect to Taiwan, many African states, of course, have switched from recognizing Taiwan to China. More than that, you may recall, I think it was Kenya, sent 22 Taiwanese that they had arrested back to not to Taiwan, but China, right? And South China Sea, if you might recall, China mentioned that, there are so many countries that support us in the South China Sea, hardly any in Asia, but a lot from Africa. Right? And North Korea. You may have noticed that the U.S. is starting to put sanctions, or looking at sanctions on Namibia and some other African countries because they have been trading and aiding in various ways North Korea. And of course, in the UN and the G20 and the G77, China gains a lot of support from Africans because of this aid effort. Now, aid, of course, generates Western criticism and criticism in Africa along the same lines. First of all, there's cultural friction, which I don't think we have to go into here. Next, many projects fall short. Many projects are substandard. They fail. They don't operate properly. China is accused of debt trap diplomacy, deliberately indebting recipients in order to seize assets or to gain political influence. There are questions of sustainability, environmentally. Many of these projects aren't designed to be environmentally sustainable, technically sustainable, financially sustainable, all these socially sustainable in terms of being acceptable to local people. Chinese aid projects have a history of problems in these areas. Also, Chinese aid breeds corruption. It's we trust you, you trust us. That approach to aid, of course, allows the lack of transparency. In fact, the total opaqueness of Chinese aid is the perfect cover for corrupt practices. And China also has not shied away from aiding odious regimes that Western donors shun because of human rights or democracy violations. And China, as a result, opens itself to charges of neo-colonialism. But on the other, a lot of these criticisms by the West, maybe it's just sour grapes. If you look at the history of the Western Africa, it's not so great either. But nevertheless, there is a difference today between Western and Chinese aid. But China doesn't really show. It shows the sensitivity of these problems, and in fact, is trying to address many of these things, but without joining the Western aid regime. without making common cause with the West. A lot of people like to compare World Bank versus Exim Bank financing in Africa. You can see here that in 2000 there was no competition at all. Today it's pretty much neck and neck. You can see here, this is Chinese popularity, you know, China is far and away more popular in Africa than it is in the other regions. And here's an interesting one. This is a public opinion survey asking people in a number of African countries what would be the best model to follow. The U.S. is the most popular, but China is a close second. Here is Chinese versus U.S. foreign direct investment in Africa. China is the dark red, the U.S. is the pink. You can see that Chinese direct investment, of course this is yearly flows. The stock of American direct investment in Africa is still larger than China's, but you can see on a current flow basis, China is certainly outpacing the U.S. And here's Chinese and U.S. aid with Africa, and you can see that China's trade far exceeds that of the U.S. today. Now let's talk a bit about Japanese aid. I know this is not of great interest to you, but I'm just doing this for purposes of comparison. Japanese aid basically starts in Africa in a search for resources. There's no real political agenda here. And it starts slow. And it only grows to a significant amount because of U.S. pressure. In fact, you know, by the end of the 80s and into the early 90s, you know, Africa got less than 2% of Japanese trade and investment, but it was getting about 15% of its aid. And that's mostly because of Western pressure on Japan. This is the period of trade and defense friction between Japan and the West. So one way for Japan to make up for its deficits in trade, behavior, and defense was to give a disproportionate aid effort, right, in alliance with the West. And Africa was like its task, right? This was Japan was going to give a lot of aid to Africa on behalf of the Western alliance. Okay. So here you see this is after the Cold War, and this is when other Western donors are cutting back on aid. Japan steps up aid from TCAD 1. This is the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. It happens every 5 years. Japan takes the lead on this. And again, you know, this is a political agenda, but not one that Japan thought up itself. This is one that has been like an alliance obligation. It's quite different from China's political motivation. 2001 to 2008, this is when Japan is cutting back on its aid quite a bit because of the lost decades of growth. And so the Japanese aid effort in Africa begins to decline. However, things turn around from 2008. And the reason is that I previously mentioned the first FOCAC summit in 2006. That's the one where you had so many African heads of state. And this was shocking to Japan, because Japan always thought that with this conference that Japan was with the leader of aid in Africa, but all of a sudden here's FOCAC, here's China with FOCAC showing it up. So Japan decides, well, we better try harder. So Japan boosts aid volume. At the same time, Japan reforms its aid program. The so-called new JICA is formed that brings grant aid, technical aid, and loan aid under one roof Um, Japan begins to think about differentiating its aid from other Western donors. And it also begins to think about cooperating with other aid donors. And but efforts to cooperate with China are rebuffed. Many efforts were made, but nothing concrete has ever come from these overtures. TCAT 5 in 2013. Here, Abe explicitly tries to compete with Africa. At the same time, Abe changes the focus of aid, Japanese aid, away from promoting an OECD agenda of good governance, human rights, democracy, and really tries to bring it back to the original type of Japanese aid, which in fact the Chinese copied in their model, which is to link aid to Japanese trade and investment interests, and in particular to the construction of infrastructure. So you can see here's 2008. After 2008, you can see Japanese aid starts to grow again. This was during the period of aid fatigue. And you can see not just the amount, but the types of Japanese aid diversifies. And here you can see also the Japanese, the investment from 2009 to 14 begins to grow, whereas before it had pretty much been, the growth was very small, it's negligible. Here's looking at, here's Japan versus China, okay. This is merchandise trade. You can see here's China's growing, here's Japan. And again, this partly reflects the nature of Chinese exports, Japanese exports and imports. You can see here, though, India has substantial interest in Africa. So comparing timelines, 1960 politically motivated begins, right? After 1989, China turns to Africa for political support. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that Chinese aid has always been motivated by politics. And 95 to 96, high-level visits begin. That's Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin both visit in this time period, and then they put China-Africa relations on a new track, and they define what Dubai Yuanzhu would mean, and this whole effort begins. In the 2010s, China adds these other issues like sustainability, social, cultural, military, strategic dimensions to realize strategic goals. For Japan, things begin with an economic motivation, very limited. It only increases aid under Western pressure. TCAD 2008, Japan responds to China's aid challenge, but it really doesn't have a clear strategic goal in mind. There's no real strategy other than to try to somehow compete with China and maintain Japanese influence, but there's no real strategic goal and drive, vision for this aid relationship. Okay, now South-South versus North-South aid. Here you can see a difference. Now both donors are late developing Asian countries, not part of the West. But China cooperates with other donors on ad hoc, selective basis for specific purposes. And so-called triangle cooperation in Africa is done only if the African side wants it. So, in other words, China is not going to organize some kind of triangle cooperation with another donor and then solicit African recipients. Okay. Japan does things quite differently. It accepts OECD norms. In terms of aid, it believes in multi-stakeholder country-level coordination, right, country-specific, with different levels of involvement from all different kinds of people, very open, transparent process. And it promotes triangle cooperation with other, including developing country donors from 2008. Brazil, Malaysia, Japan is implementing programs in Africa with these donors. I don't know what's going on with India, between Japan and India and Africa, but certainly that's an area that I think Japan would welcome. Here I just want to mention some institutional situation similarities between Japan and China. They're both Asian developmental states. They both do a sort of East Asian model of foreign aid, in which aid is tied to trade and investment interests, and primarily loan financed, focusing on infrastructure and industrial production. Right. And both countries view Africa as being important for energy resources and future growth markets. But where they differ is here, and this is mostly the political dimension. China's agenda is to promote socialism with Chinese characteristics, as you all know. Right? And China's strategic goal is a China-centered world order. This is the 2049 agenda, right? The Chinese dream. Ultimate aim is to guarantee CPC survival in a hostile liberal world. So, in other words, it doesn't make a lot of sense for China to then buy into OECD, buy into what the whole North-South framework. China prefers instead to construct a South-South framework of cooperation. In China's language, particularly in aid, the liberal West is ideologically, culturally, and politically othered. Right? It's we South against the North, and all this stuff. So the result is Chinese-led South-South cooperation struggling against North-South cooperation. So, in other words, Chinese aid builds an alternative South-South cooperation framework, a bunch of institutions, AIIB, BRICS Bank, these funds, these development funds, China-Africa development funds, you name it. Okay. And China has a clear economic and strategic goals in Africa. I think they're very strategic, they're very far forward-looking, and understand quite clearly what they want. Now here, Japan is quite different. Japan considers itself to be a member of the G7, considers itself to be a civilian power, no military strategic component to its aid, and not much in its strategic policies except to be a member of the West. Japan converged with the ODA norms because, first of all, domestically, democratic institutions and values. People want transparency. They don't want corruption. They want democratic participation, et cetera, et cetera. And then also the dependence on the U.S. for security, markets, and energy. It gives the OECD and the U.S. quite a bit of leverage over Japan. And so, as a result, Japan really has no independent vision or strategy, other than to promote or in the early stages, to promote its own recovery and development. Today, it's at a bit of a loss of what to do. And basically, it's satisfied with a peaceful, law-governed world. It's a democratic state dedicated to safe, comfortable existence for its own people. It doesn't feel besieged, except by China these days. It doesn't feel very besieged by the rest of the world. It has no independent military strategic agenda. So on all these points, Chinese aid and Japanese aid are quite a study in contrast. Okay, so sorry to take up your time like this. I know it's difficult after lunch. So, quite happy to discuss this. I'd much rather talk about Doklam. But you know,
We can discuss the club also later. Well, thank you very much, Professor Arase, for that extremely, lucid and clear exposition on your understanding of China's, aid strategy vis-a-vis Africa and how it contrasts with one pursued by Japan. You have brought out that China has a very clear political, one may even say strategically driven approach for expanding its aid, eventually to put it for Africa. And this is something very different from Japan, which doesn't have a clear vision or strategy, which is independent of the larger Western ODA approach towards Africa. You have brought out that China has derived both political strategic dividends, including in terms of positive perceptions about China and Africa, as also economic commercial benefits from its aid program. It's by no means an untied aid, because there are very clear objectives meant to promote both China's political, strategic, economic and commercial interests, as also China's ultimate objective of moving towards a China-centric world order. We have put it across very clearly. Now we'll open the floor for discussion. Just to set the ball rolling, I wanted to pose a few questions. Essentially, building on points you already made. You talked about Western criticism of China's aid policy vis-a-vis Africa. How do you look at Africa's own perceptions about Chinese aid? One reads in the media, especially Western media, reports about pushback in Africa, including criticism about how it can lead to indebtedness, problems of environmental degradation, how many of the projects have not been effective, how they are essentially white elephant without sufficient due diligence or economic viability studies before those projects are undertaken. So this is one I want to look at Chinese aid from perspective of Africa rather than from Chinese perspective or the Western perspective. That's one. Secondly, when you are looking at Chinese aid program, as an independent scholar, how do you look at the effectiveness of Chinese aid program, not proceeding from certain objectives China had set for itself? Looked at from that perspective, it might be quite productive. But again, a beneficiary oriented approach. If you look at from African perspective, have these aid projects been effective? Have they yielded the desired results for the intended beneficiaries? And thirdly, the long term, the question we are facing, for instance, in our neighborhood in Sri Lanka, for instance, a very serious problem of indebtedness, leading to a situation where debt equity swap, which we also referred to in context of Africa, is becoming aware, because Sri Lanka is not in a position to repay $8 billion plus that it has already acquired. How do you look at sustainability of Chinese aid policy vis-a-vis Africa when there is accumulation of debt and of projects which have not yielded economic benefits?
Okay. Well, I've thought about these issues a bit, and I have glib answers to many of them. But African perceptions, it varies by country, because, in some countries, there's, there are communal tensions, where many Chinese have settled and they're conducting business and they monopolize business opportunities and things. I mean, it's a problem. Other countries, their presence is light on the ground, and you don't have that element. So, but I think, generally speaking, my sense is that at a popular level, most Africans just see like an all-weather road being built by the Chinese, and it's good. It works. I can get from one town to another fast now, in all weather, and the Chinese build it. So I think there's a tendency, I think, in the West to overemphasize the critiques of Chinese aid that appear in the newspapers of democratic countries in Africa, or more democratic countries, but at a more fundamental level, I think there is an appeal to Chinese aid, even though many of it fails. But if you compare the percentage of success of Chinese aid to the success of their own government's projects, it begins to look pretty good, right? So, so that's number one. Now, as far as resistance, there are many questions are being asked, and one of the problems, it seems to me, is that although the financial feasibility, sustainability is maybe not even there, the economic feasibility or sustainability may not be there. Technically, maybe not. Maybe these things can't be maintained. They can't be operated properly. And you can point all these things out, but does it really matter if your government is not responsive to popular or even critics in the media or critics in academic universities pointing things to that? If the government is immune to these kinds of pressures, this kind of aid just continues, right? Because people in the government are receiving such benefits from this aid. So it's the irony here is, those of you, you must all be following China, you must know that within the past year, Xi Jinping has said that provincial leaders will be liable for life if they over-indebt their provinces. Right? If they borrow too much money in order to get good growth figures, they get promoted. Right? And then they get promoted, but then later on everybody realizes, hey, that's just because this guy took on too much debt, then that guy's going to pay a price. See, you don't have that system in Africa, right? Governments take on a lot of debt, they put in these great figures, and then they retire, and they're out of the picture. So again, this is the problem of good governance. And this is one of the good things about Western aid. At least the West is trying to work on this, trying to get accountable government, which will mean good government, sustainable projects, better quality projects. But yeah, China is quite good at focusing on things that might not be very pretty, but it's politically somehow it works. It has some kind of sustainability to it. So I wouldn't really count on a big wave of African discontent with Chinese aid to throw the Chinese out of Africa. I don't think that's likely to happen. That is,
So
My question is whether China is really overreaching itself. China is still a low to middle income country, it's a low to middle tech country. Its managerial systems are still very traditional. So at this level, is China really overreaching itself with such a global policy? I could put this question also with regard to the Old World, the Belt and Silk Road and so on. So, and there's a temptation.
Yeah.
There's a temptation in this country to compete with China in this regard, which would be, I think, foolish because, again, the question
No,
of
India
overreaching.
should, India should not.
We'll take a couple of questions.
Thank you very much. I found it fascinating that we've come across a study which is fairly extensive in terms of looking at Chinese foreign aid practices and comparison with other global practices. And I'm surely some of those numbers would be worth analyzing in much more detail. But very broadly, you have mentioned that the drivers of the Chinese investment effort are largely trade and investment promotion. And of course, you also mentioned that starting from the turn of after the Cold War, one of the principal reasons was also for looking for political support. That was one of the reasons. But when you compare with the Western practices, the Chinese practices, etc., if you look at the larger question of assistance, I mean the philosophy, one would think that probably, I mean not associating any value judgments for a particular thing, but one of the good principles, if I may say so, could be if you can assist somebody so that in turn helps, enables him to help himself. Is assistance given by China in a manner you can look at it from that perspective? Let's say, I mean, you mentioned several projects, railway project, infrastructure project, etc. I can understand maybe at the beginning, you may need to give equipment, you may need to give labor, you may need to give financial support, everything in a package. But subsequent assistance to the same country, for example, has it resulted in training? Has it resulted in establishment of institutions which will enable them to help themselves? Has China looked at these factors and would some statistics be available about this aspect? Or is it that you just look at each project and see mainly whether it promotes trade and investment and then go ahead? It does in a way impinge on the question earlier asked by Ambassador Kant about the sustainability as well, because if they are not able to repay the loans, then there's a problem. The second question that I wish to ask is more in terms of a fact. You had mentioned in one of the slides, you had clubbed the interest-free loans and grants as one. I'm very interested to know the grant component and the interest-free loan component. My understanding is the Chinese grant component is very, very limited.
Yes.
On the other hand, the Japanese grant component is fairly high. I would request a clarification on this.
Okay. Let me just answer that last one first, because that's a little technical. The others involve what you asked and what this gentleman asked. A grant is 100% grant element, right? You don't expect any repayment. A loan, if a loan is given at a commercial rate, that is the going market rate, it has zero concessionality. Okay, it's not a concession, it's a commercial loan. Now, if you give a loan at an interest rate that's below the market rate, then there's a formula. It's an algebraic formula that OECD uses to calculate a grant element. It's based on the discount value of the loan, okay? So,
When you say the market rate, is it the market rate for the country or some international standard?
well, the OECD uses a 10% discount rate. That's above the market rate today, the prevailing market rate. So, in other words, if you give a loan at, let's say, 5%, if you're using the 10% reference rate, then you're going to get a grant element because it's below. Now, if you're giving a no interest loan, right, where you're not charging interest, but you're still asking for your money back, that's going to have a large grant element, but it's not a grant, because you're asking. So I don't know precisely what that number is. I'm not really good at algebra. I can't. The formula is actually not. It's a little complicated, so I can't tell you offhand what it would be. But the interest-free loans, first of all, they're not grants. They have a substantial grant element. So you're right to point out that putting grants with interest-free loans together is a bit, it's maybe not right. But let me also say that China not often, but if a borrower is in a difficult situation repaying a loan, and if it has good political relations with China, China has been known to forgive the loans, particularly the interest-free loans. So that's I think that's as good an answer as I can give at this point. As far as the other things, capacity building is Chinese aid actually building capacity? The ability of recipients to help themselves, to develop themselves. Here, the Chinese projects typically have not scored very well by aid experts, by recipients. Chinese contractors usually come in, build it, and leave. There's not a lot of training. There's a training element. But one area where I think China is consciously trying to build capacity is through educational exchange. So it doesn't happen in these projects because many of these, particularly the big capital-intensive projects, they're about building production, getting resources out of Africa. But if you want to talk about a capacity-building effort, I think the educational exchange programs are what you want to look at. There, I think. There are tens of thousands of African students today in China on scholarship. So in that area, if you want to talk about capacity, that's probably the area you look at. I wouldn't look at the projects for that. China's about something else. When it's doing those projects, it's really focused on something else. Now, as far as overreaching and sustainability from the Chinese side, well, one of the great things about having a state-owned banking system and having an authoritarian government that will not tolerate protests, it will not tolerate citizens asking questions, is that when loans go bad, nobody knows. And banks don't fail. So China's ability to cover bad loans, and you see it today, right? And you all know China's got a huge proportion of its loans are bad or non-performing loans. But the system keeps going because China has total control over national savings, has control over the behavior of savers, right? The borrowers. So it's a very peculiar system. This is not a normal capitalist system. This is socialism with Chinese characteristics, okay, what we're talking about. So China's ability to give these loans use these loans. Nobody back home is asking questions about this. You don't have people in Congress, you don't have NGOs asking where's the money going. Nothing like this. The problem, however, is that if the whole Chinese system hits the wall, if we have a so-called hard landing, a black swan event, which everybody's talking about today, right? Then China's in trouble. Then this whole mechanism, I think, breaks down. China's overreaching at that point, for sure. One of the interesting questions to ask today is China overreaching itself? It's hard to say. Nobody really knows. We have never seen this kind of an economic system. Nobody knows how long it can go on with these Ponzi schemes at home. So, and everybody has a different opinion about it, right? Gordon Chang has been saying China's going to collapse since 2002. Since 2002, right? It still hasn't collapsed. It's still going pretty strong. So, what can you? Nobody really knows. But my sense is that there's a very good probability that we're going to have a major crisis in China, an economic crisis. That's just my sense. In the next 5, 6, 7 years, or something like that. And maybe, who knows? But I think that right now the level of debt is unsustainable, and it's showing in many different areas. They're having to improvise or go backwards, reintroducing capital controls, things like this. These are things they didn't really want to do. So right now the whole system is very ad hoc. They're holding together the system by being inventive, month to month. So but we'll see how long this can go on. And then finally, let me just anyway. So I'll just stop there. Did you?
I just wanted the.
Sorry.
Okay.
If you don't mind, we'll just come back to it.
My question is about the second half of the presentation, Japan. China, you spoke at length about the Chinese aid program, the timeline. My simple understanding of the Chinese aid program is acquisition of real estate. That's what they've done in Minnesota. That's what they're doing elsewhere. Anyway, but in Japan, we have a lot of interest in the Japanese aid program in all Africa. In fact, we have the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which is an India-Japan joint. It's still in the proposal stage, but being worked very seriously between the two countries. Launched in a big way, but the nuts bolts are being still worked out. The fact that this is a good program, the proof is that the Chinese media started reacting.
Yeah, exactly.
And
that's right.
the proof that it is hurting is that their mouthpieces have started screaming, saying that this is going to hurt my program, sort of a thing. So it's good. Japan is not only beleaguered only with China. There's a far more, especially the Japanese under present leadership, is taking quite a bit of initiative in that. So I believe that the Chinese and Japanese aid competition in Africa might not take place. There may not be a competition. Could be run in parallel, but the quality of the two would be so different and it will be visible. About the Chinese one, about the people, what they think of the Chinese, etc., the African people, the fact, I think you beautifully defined it as mutual trust. That's a lovely phrase. Mutual trust not between countries, but between the leaders of the two countries. And they have a lovely time. Once they have the mutual trust, you don't ask me what happens with my money, how I spend it, and I will not ask you what you did with the money I gave you. So with that type of principle, the value of those products will continue to deteriorate on some time. Trans-Siberian Railway was a great success story day one, started deteriorating. Today it's in a totally different country. So my simple question is, the Japanese, or let me put it as, Japan has got a lot of experience in its aid program. We have also launched, India has launched its own aid program in a far more concerted and a scientific manner. And there is a congruence of these two ideas being now formalized. Would you, as a professor dealing with the subject, sitting in the West, how do you look at the India-Japan collaboration in developmental programs in Africa?
What we'll do, we'll combine all the questions.
Okay.
Running out of time.
Sure.
Then we'll just come to you next. Please. Yeah, you can ask.
I wanted, Professor,
Yeah,
I
but
wanted,
please ask the question because we're running out of time.
I wanted to figure, what percentage does China give as foreign aid?
Percentage of what?
Foreign aid is what percentage figure?
GDP.
Oh, GDP?
Oh, yeah, yes.
Well,
We'll come to all questions.
Okay.
Approximately.
okay.
Ravi?
Thank you, Professor Arase, for a very interesting presentation. My name is Ravi Bhuthaningam from the Institute of Chinese Studies. My question is this, that if you take the 54 odd African countries and rank them for these last 15 odd years that this program has been running, the aid program, if you rank them in terms of economic growth, non-economic growth, longevity, health, and all these parameters, and if you were to plot a chart, where they would be over these 15 years, and if on that map you were to superimpose your other map of Chinese aid program over 1 billion, 100 million, 2 billion, etc., then what kind of correlation, if any, would you find? Would you find any relationship between the growth rates and the aid? Would you find it a jumble, or what would you find? Because I suspect that those results would kind of throw light upon your implication that a lot of this aid just trickles away here and there and into various people's pockets. So that would be some sort of indication as to how effectively these countries are using their money to develop themselves. Get it?
Okay.
Okay, so Suresh, and then that's it. Now, I think
Very briefly, since one of the questions that I had on the Africa Asia economic growth corridor, my friend is already I have spent about 8 years in Africa for my total diplomatic career, and in many ways, your observations about the aid or the Chinese is going in terms of large infrastructure projects, more or less matches with what my observation is. I also found that mostly when it comes, it goes, it's a lock, stock and barrel kind of a thing, driven by the state-owned enterprises. They bring in their labor, they bring in their resources, everything. Very little actually touches or engages. Yes, that's part of the question. Now my question is that when we see that, there was a very interesting observation you made, that in these African countries, when they talk about the best national economic development model, it is USA and China, practically close. What does that perception of the best economic development or national development actually mean? Because if it doesn't people, then if it doesn't touch people, what does this development mean for the people in Africa?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Professor David.
yeah, very brief.
Yeah, brief question is very simple. Please try to elaborate why you have taken Japan. China always try to compare with USA, number one. Number two, USA always have interest in military purpose. But in Japan you said they have no military purpose. Do China have any military purpose in Africa also?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very brief. No comment, just question.
Professor, have you ever envisioned that there will be a one world government
One world.
One world government one day.
Let's start with that.
No. That's a very simple answer. No. No, I don't envision that. And so, it's difficult. I mean, I'm not, maybe what China is doing is a good thing. Introducing a little bit of pluralism in the world. But I'm just observing what I see. I'm not really passing judgment on it. I'm just analyzing what China's strategic aims are. As far as the Asia-Africa growth corridor is, and its prospects, I think it's a good idea and quite necessary because the Japanese are good at things the Chinese are not good at. The field office structure of the Japanese, lots of people on the ground. They have over 100 offices in the world, right? They've been doing aid a long time. They know how to do infrastructure aid. They know how to do high-tech aid. They can design smart cities. They can also go into villages, do village-level projects. So the JICA actually has a lot of experience, and they don't have this like strategic military agenda that the U.S. has, which I think for India might be good. might be something on the positive side. And the Africa-Asia Growth Corridor is going to work in parallel with One Belt, One Road. And the African countries are going to welcome this because they don't want to be over-dependent on China, and they can already feel this over-dependence. The Chinese tend to be a little overbearing, right? And they're feeling it now. And so they will welcome. What recipient wouldn't welcome donor competition, right? So this is a no-brainer. And the fact is that to the extent that One Belt, One Road succeeds, it's going to actually benefit India and Japan by creating this connectivity. This connectivity, although the ports will be owned and operated by China, in peacetime, everybody will be able to use these ports. Now, if there's ever a war or something, don't count on these ports. But in normal times, everybody can benefit. Right? So, and I think it's important for donors like Japan and India, and of course countries that are going to be dependent on the African market and on African resources. It's important for them to have their own facilities that they can count on to maintain the strategic trade. So it's very important, and it's going to benefit everybody. The Africans are going to benefit. In fact, even the Chinese are going to benefit from this, right? So it's a good idea. As far as aid to GDP ratio, it's got to be like maybe a tenth of a percent. Again, you get into this whole question: what is aid? What do you count as aid? Do you count just ODA, the Chinese equivalent of ODA, or do you count everything that China is lending? So, you can look at the figures. If China is giving, let's say, $12 billion a year, that's not much compared to its GDP. It's a pittance. So, development indicators in Africa versus Chinese aid. There have been a lot of econometric studies trying to correlate aid receipts with development growth. No statistically significant results. There's no correlation. You can't find statistically a correlation between aid receipts and actual performance, which is one of the biggest criticisms of aid. And so you might ask, well, why does aid continue? Well, it's because something else is going on. Right? It's serving some other purpose. a development model, U.S. versus China, I think, I don't know, why exactly, or on what basis the Africans are comparing China and the U.S. But my guess is that they're attracted by the American lifestyle, high consumption. Yes. But with the Chinese, what they see is the roads being built. They also know that China has, against the odds, industrialized at a rapid rate, and they have succeeded, right? And so that for them has got to be attractive because they've been trying to. They started out at similar levels of development after World War II. And look at where China is today compared to most African countries.
So basically glitter.
What?
Basically glitter.
Glitter. Glitter works. Yes, it's easy to understand. Bling. And then, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to take up a lot of time with technical answers. I'm just answering in very simple language. Right? So.
Thank you very much, Professor Arase. It has been an educative experience for us. You gave a fascinating talk on various aspects of China's both its policy and practices towards Africa, and comparing it with that of Japan and Western donors. So let me thank you on behalf of everyone present here, and please join me in giving a big round of applause to Professor Arase.